Giacomo Colosimo hailed from the Calabria region of Italy. Dates for his birth vary, with the most often cited date being in the year 1878, possibly on or around February 16th. In 1895, his father, Luigi, and his second wife immigrated to Chicago when James, or Jim as he liked to be called, was approximately 17 years old. He had legitimate work at first, laboring as both a newspaper delivery boy and a shoe shiner. Later, he worked for the sanitation department, pushing a broom throughout Chicago's First Ward, a vice-ridden, red-light section of the city. Not seeing a future in sanitation, Jim tried his hand at petty theft, pickpocketing, and as a pimp. But without political clout giving him cover for his illegal activities, he was soon arrested. And it was here that Jim Colosimo became connected with the Chicago underworld. The First Ward was run by two of Chicago's most crooked politicians, Michael Hinky Dink Kenna and Bathhouse John Coughlin. Jim hit it off with the two aldermen. He was hired by the duo to be the precinct captain for the Democratic Party and as a bagman, collecting kickbacks from the brothels operating in the First Ward. Crime historian J. Robert Nash notes, in this capacity, Colosimo met Victoria Moresco, an obese and aging madam who ran an Armour Avenue whorehouse and was attracted to Jim's swarthy animal magnetism. She offered him the managership of her brothel, and he immediately accepted, marrying Victoria 2 weeks later in the bargain. As 1901 became 1902, young Jim Colosimo's star was on the rise. He and Victoria opened numerous new brothels, and Colosimo became involved in a uniquely Italian extortion scheme known as the Black Hand. Preying on fellow Italians, the Black Hander would threaten violence against one's family or business unless they paid a large sum of money. The target usually received a handwritten note explaining the consequences and the amount to be paid, and the letter was signed by dipping their hand in black ink and applying it to the note, hence the name, the Black Hand. In a few years, Colosimo ran a network of nearly 200 brothels and began getting involved with gambling and other rackets. As a result of his large frame and manly mannerisms, folks in the First Ward called him Big Jim, but due to his growing wardrobe, which was flashy to say the least, he earned another nickname that demonstrated his growing power and influence, Diamond Jim. Without shame, Jim displayed his success by wearing diamond belt buckles, diamond-studded shirts, diamond rings, and diamond cufflinks. Around 1908, Big Jim was clearly in charge of most of Chicago's underworld, with prostitution being the cornerstone of his criminal empire. He owned everything from $2 whorehouses to swanky upscale brothels featuring choice hand-picked girls who catered to the upper crust of Chicago society. The two most popular were the Saratoga and the Victoria, which he named after his wife. But Big Jim's schemes didn't stop there. He hired an army of young thugs to strong-arm dozens of union officials, taking over leadership positions and skimming money from their coffers. J. Robert Nash writes, Big Jim became a millionaire. To add to his personal glitter, the gangster opened the gaudiest, poshest, most elegant nightclub west of the Alleghenies, Colosimo's Cafe at 2126 South Wabash Avenue. The cafe became a meeting place where the credible upper world of Chicago's esteemed citizenry could rub elbows with the gangster element that inhabited the city's underworld. But Colosimo's army and clout could not protect him from one thing: other blackhanders who wanted a taste of his criminal empire. In 1909, Big Jim received an extortion letter demanding money or else. Fearing for his life, he paid the extortionist, hoping the problem would just go away, but they came back for more. Realizing the demand for money would never end, Colosimo sent for his wife's nephew, Johnny Torrio, a well-respected self-made gangster from New York. Torrio handled the situation with the Blackhanders, and Big Jim was never bothered again. Colosimo was so grateful that he made Torrio his second in command, and when Torrio needed another soldier he could trust to help him run Big Jim's affairs, he sent for the man he had counted on most often during his time in the Big Apple, a strong, confident slugger and enforcer who had made a name for himself during the old street wars in New York. His name was Al Capone. During the next decade, things went along just fine for the trio. Big Jim divorced his fat whorehouse wife Victoria and married a young, vivacious showgirl named Dale Winter, a sweet-faced 19-year-old ravishing beauty from Ohio. Big Jim was so enamored with his attractive young bride that he left more and more of the running of his empire to Torrio and Capone. The year was 1919, and Prohibition had just arrived. Torrio and Capone saw dollar signs, but Big Jim, he was comfortable, and he didn't see a need to venture into the new racket. J. Robert Nash narrates, Torrio all but got on his knees before his opera-loving uncle, begging Jim to branch out into hijacking and bootlegging. The National Prohibition Act, Torrio argued, was heaven sent for the likes of them. There would be millions, super millions, to be made by selling illegal hooch. But Colosimo had grown fat and content with what he had. We stay with the whores, Johnny, he said, and scoffed at Torrio's wild schemes. Torrio loved his uncle and sponsor, as well as abhorring violence. But this was business, and Big Jim was in the way. On May 11th, Torrio informed his uncle that a shipment of booze was coming to the cafe, and the bootleggers wanted to meet with Big Jim personally. Colosimo was furious that Torrio couldn't deal with the bootleggers himself. He had plans that day to fawn and cater to his lovely wife. But Torrio insisted that his schedule was too busy, and he would be unable to get by for the meeting. Bitterly, Big Jim acquiesced to his nephew's request. As his driver drove him to the cafe, Big Jim sat in the back seat of the car, muttering angrily in Italian. When it was obvious that the bootleggers were running late, Big Jim complained to his secretary, Frank Camilla. What was taking so long, he asked. Camilla went to find out why. He returned with a puzzled look on his face and informed the boss that there were no scheduled whiskey deliveries due that day. Big Jim then asked the bartender, Jim O'Leary, and O'Leary responded that he too was unaware of any deliveries that were scheduled for that day. Thinking Torrio must have gotten his times and days mixed up, Big Jim had had enough. He announced that he was leaving and went to retrieve his coat. As Jim prepared to leave the bar, 2 gunshots rang out from the cloakroom. Big Jim toppled over dead on the spot. The only witness to the murder was a waiter who saw the assassin jump out of the cloakroom and steal Colosimo's wallet and rush out the door. The waiter later told police that he didn't recognize the killer, but stated that he had been eating ice cream and drinking apricot brandy earlier in the restaurant when Big Jim first arrived. The waiter retrieved the killer's receipt, which had a message scribbled on the back. So long, vampire, so long, lefty. The meaning of this message has never been deciphered. So who killed Big Jim Colosimo? The waiter, who was the only one who caught a glimpse of the shooter, identifying a mugshot belonging to one Francesco Iole, also known as Frankie Yale. Yale and Torrio had been close since their days in New York. Yale worked for Johnny, and when Torrio left the Big Apple for the Windy City, he happily handed over all of his interest to his friend and trusted aide. An unidentified informant later told police that Torrio paid Yale $10,000 after the murder, but this story was never confirmed. Yale, who was in Chicago at the time of the murder, was arrested. However, the waiter refused to testify, and Yale was released, returning to New York. Years later, doubt was cast over Yale's guilt when Al Capone allegedly confessed to the murder during a conversation with Charles MacArthur, a journalist well known for his associations with mobsters. To many, the confession sounded credible, but others believed the waiter was a more credible witness and continued to label Yale as Big Jim's assassin. To this date, Big Jim Colosimo's murder is an unsolved cold case. But there was a final mystery surrounding the murder of Big Jim, and it had to do with his estate. His attorneys expected to find at least $500,000 in cash and a fortune in bonds and jewelry. But the money, bonds, and jewelry only added up to a total of $76,394, leaving his wife Dale puzzled as to the whereabouts of the larger portion of her inheritance. Despite the disappearance of his money, Colosimo's funeral was nothing short of extravagant, and it became a hallmark for the big gangster send-offs of the 1920s. The procession was led by 53 pallbearers, with city officials, judges, and congressmen among their ranks. Over 1,000 members of the Democratic Party marched to the tune of 2 brass bands. The Archbishop forbade a Catholic burial on the grounds that Colosimo was a public sinner because he divorced his first wife, Victoria, and married Dale Winter. Despite this, his old friend and the alderman of the First Ward, Bathhouse John Coughlin, recited the funeral prayers, and Big Jim Colosimo was buried at Oakwood Cemetery in Chicago